and it started to come up during the out-of-competition testing model rule consideration. It's coming up with consideration on the use of bisphosphonates in young horses, and given some of the concerns that you've heard about here today. And that is, at what point should a racing commission have jurisdiction over the actual horse? Now, we did a survey of the ARCI members, and as usual, some members are very diligent in responding to that survey, and others just leave it on a pile. But we did get a number of responses from various jurisdictions, and one of the things we asked is that at what point does your commission have jurisdiction over the actual horse? We have people saying we should outlaw bisphosphonates in young horses. Do you have jurisdiction over young horses? Some commissions have jurisdiction when the horse is on the grounds of a licensed facility. Some jurisdictions don't have jurisdiction over the horse until it's entered into a race. Probably Kentucky has probably the broadest jurisdiction over the horse, because you have jurisdiction over the horse if it's under the care and control of a licensed owner. So this is a tough issue, because we are looking at things like out-of-competition testing. We have a model rule which requires a notification and in some cases approval in a limited sense for the use of certain treatments. We require horses to go on the vet's list for periods of time, which makes them ineligible to enter, and the vet's list is a regulatory action. And as we're going down this road, and it's a good road to go down, I think, we need to better define at what point we as regulators should have jurisdiction over the actual horse. And we've got three experts.
Are they coming?
And good friends
No,
to
we've got
give
a
their
room full of
perspective
experts.
on that. Because I think it would behoove all of us to work on a model regulatory policy so that we have uniformity in terms of when the horse should come under the jurisdiction of the racing commission. And, you know, when we talk about out-of-competition testing or questioning the use of certain medications, the first thing somebody's going to say is, hey, well, you don't have jurisdiction over this horse, and you don't regulate the practice of veterinary medicine. You know, the veterinary boards do. Well, the adequacy of the current jurisdictional parameters in various states, we think needs to be discussed and talked about. So I'll start first with Matt Uliano, as Executive Vice President of the Jockey Club.
Thank you, Ed. I just have a couple of opening comments. I understand this is going to be an interactive discussion, so I don't want to hog the commentary side of it, but I'm glad Ed framed this up the correct way, and that is as a out-of-competition testing question more than anything. And naturally, the follow-up question to that is, when do you throw a blanket over the horse? When does the regulatory authority then paint a target on that horse? We've got some, because of our international relationships with other studbook authorities internationally, and likewise racing jurisdictions internationally, we have some experience with how they do it. And I'll share some of that for perspective, and then maybe just try to bring it home and indicate a possibility that's open for discussion here for the United States. But effectively, in Great Britain is probably the best place to start. The British have gone through a series of reforms on their rules of racing, as you probably noted in the press recently. They've done quite a bit, the latest of which is they're looking to establish jurisdiction over the horse at an earlier and earlier phase in its life cycle. And to that end, they've approached Weatherby's, which is the registration authority in Great Britain and Ireland, seeking them to impose a registration requirement. It's in the discussion phase, so I don't want to speak in definites, but it's one of the ideas that's been tossed out, is that, well, if we could get the horses registered early, that way we could paint a target on them early and then submit them to the out-of-competition testing protocol that Great Britain already has in place. Now, keep in mind that this is in addition to their current system they have, in which inventories of yards, yards are the training areas that trainers maintain. They have an inventory of horses. Those inventories have to be reported to the British Horse Racing Authority periodically, and there are fines that are attached if they do a spot inspection and they determine that there are more or less horses than what appears on the inventory sheet. And they use that as the basis for their more or less whereabouts reporting, where the horse is at any given time, so that when they deploy an out-of-competition testing protocol, they know where to go, which horse to look for, and they can go ahead and conduct their sampling. So that's one phase of it. That's from the racing side of it. And then just for background, and then I'll turn it over to Tom, most stud book authorities currently have a requirement, and it's in everybody's best interest that this requirement's there. It forces people to report early. It gets information into the stud book early. It allows decisions to be made at sales early. It allows all that flow of information to occur at an accelerated pace, and that's in everyone's interest. And what that key requirement is that within 30 days of foaling, there's a rule that requires you to report the birth of that live foal. And once that live foal is reported, that starts the registration process. So it's in the breeder's best interest, too, to avoid late penalties, late fees, and registration. But once they report that the foal's been born, the registration process is initiated, the DNA hair kit is queued up and ready to be mailed out in a few months. But it becomes kind of the first time that that horse appears on the radar screen. And then finally, all stud book authorities have a rule of basically cooperation. If a police enforcement agency, sheriff's department, a court, a racing regulatory authority, even a racetrack, if they ask the breed registry for information, the breed registry provides that information to them. It's in the best interest of the sport, the best interest of jurisprudence. And so with the existing rules that are in place, there's a mechanism in which jurisdiction over the horse conceivably could occur as early as the birth of a live foal. Now, a couple of caveats, and I shared with Eric and Tom earlier. About 75% of thoroughbreds will make a start by the time they're 4 years old. 25% of them won't. And there's a number of reasons for that atresia. They could go on to other disciplines, who knows what, but there's a 25% leakage rate. So if you have an out-of-competition testing program that's tied to veterinarians that have to go and locate these horses and draw samples, there's a cost efficiency, cost effectiveness measure of that when you've got about, your population is reduced automatically to those that may not ever reach the racetrack. Probably a more logical place for that to begin, and this is where I'll shut up, is I think in most jurisdictions still, and I'm looking out there if I'm wrong, I'm sure I'll get corrected, but there's a published workout requirement where horses have to have at least one published workout before they start in a race. And there's technology that has been developed and is being implemented through the Jockey Club and through other entities as well, microchips and digital certificates and so forth, to improve the ability to identify those horses and to improve the information that's available to people at the racetrack, including regulatory authorities at the racetrack that's seeking information on those horses. But when the horse reaches a track and goes through the commitment of a published workout, you've at least reduced that 75%, or you've taken that 75% probably to 90%. There's probably a much greater chance that horse is going to start in a race if they go through the problems of going to a track or going to a training center and publishing a workout. That's all the opening comments I have, Ed.
Is that what they do in Great Britain?
Well, in Great Britain, It's a little different. The first thing they do is they have an inventory requirement. And in that inventory requirement, you have to declare horses in training. And then every yard has to maintain those inventories of horses in training. And the punishment's severe. If the penalty is severe, if there's any type of incongruity between what's been reported as being in a particular trainer's yard and what they find in a spot inspection, it keeps them honest. And then all those horses are considered eligible for out-of-competition testing at that point. What they want to do is to attempt to move that back to, instead of requiring on when the trainer is going to report the horse is eligible, they want to throw a blanket over the entire registered bull population.
Tom DePasquale is the executive director of the Minnesota Racing Commission, and he's a longtime accomplished attorney, and he asks a lot of tough legal questions when we have our various meetings, and we asked Tom to kind of weigh in on this topic, on at what point we should take jurisdiction over the horse that would give the commission certain protections from potential litigation for certain actions it may take.
Thanks, Ed. Actually, I think you asked me to participate in this panel before I knew what the question was, and I said yes anyways. But be that as it may.
That is true.
Well,
yes.
Where I'm really appreciative is that you scheduled the panels that we just heard for the last hour and a half before this, because since we discussed this a week or so ago, I've been engaged in a thought experiment, the subject of which I'll share with you in a minute. But the last discussion informed my thinking probably as much as anything, because it clarifies what the issue was. And the question that really resonated with me was the question by the breeder from Kentucky, who said that, you know, people think they've got a silver bullet drug here without having any awareness of what effect it's having on the horse, and without any intention to not do right by the horse. But nevertheless, it could be creating problems. Looking at it from a narrow perspective of a regulator, I start with the statutory authority that we have been given, and the understanding that nothing undermines the credibility of a regulator more than reaching beyond the enabling statute and then having a court strike that down. And just a few examples that come to mind, and I'm not passing any judgment on the commissions, but you know, the claiming rule jail that's been challenged in various jurisdictions and upheld in some areas and not in others, raises the question of what jurisdiction do we have over the disposition of someone's property and a property asset, and what can we tell them they can do with that horse and not do with that horse. The motion case in Kentucky raises the question of whether we have a rational basis to regulate in an area, and can we prove that rational basis. And I heard several comments by the vets who know as much as anybody about this that basically said we don't know all that we need to know about bisphosphonates, just to use that as an example, or the scientific evidence is lacking or equivocal. And I don't want to go out as a regulator and start to regulate and have people come in behind me as professionals and the most knowledgeable and say we can't be sure that this is having a deleterious effect. It may be having an effect on pain modulation, but not on bone growth, and we don't know for sure. Those are things that give me pause when I am thinking about whether we should reach out with our regulatory authority. In Minnesota, just by way of example, and Ed's right, the survey showed that every commission is different in this regard. We only have authority to regulate horse racing and parimutuel betting at licensed racetracks in Minnesota. That's 2 tracks. We have the right to inspect the licensed premises of a licensee. So we don't have the right to inspect off the premises of a licensed racetrack. And horses subject to examination in Minnesota are limited to those who are entered to race. So we already have some confined parameters on our regulatory authority to act beyond that. So I think you know, this raises questions about whether and how we should act, whether we need to go to the legislature to amend our statute to give us broader rights to regulate horses that may intend to race. How do we demonstrate their intent to race? Must they be within the geographic confines of the state, or are we going to have some authority to regulate extraterritorially, which raises some constitutional issues? So those are the questions that come to mind for me. If we were to promulgate rules, in Minnesota, as in many states, it has to meet the test of need and reasonableness. So that then becomes a challenge for us to very narrowly target what it is we're trying to accomplish and whether we're trying to accomplish it in the least restrictive means, and is what we're trying to do reasonable in light of our authority. And in Minnesota, those rules go before an administrative law judge who really goes over those with a fine-tooth comb and comes back with comments for revisions, et cetera. So we have some pretty tough tests to pass before we can legislate or regulate in this area. The thought that came to mind as I was listening to the discussion is whether we can partner with other parties who are closer to the questions we're trying to reach, whether it's the sales auction houses, whether it's the jockey club or other breed registries, horse persons groups, and actually create what apparently is the need for more education and more awareness about the best interest of the horse prior to the time it hits the racetrack. The other thought I had is whether hair testing or microchips or some other technology can help us with this, because once that horse comes on the track, if we have the authority to do hair testing, we can find out whether and when that horse was administered certain substances, and we can hold a person responsible provided they're a licensee, which is another question. Did that horse receive whatever it is we're trying to regulate at a time when it was under the custody, care, and control of the licensee in our state? And if not, we run into some of the same questions we did with out-of-competition testing, which is who's the responsible party? And that too begins to raise some due process questions. So that's just off the top of my head some of the regulator questions that come to mind in terms of these issues.
Eric Hamelback is the CEO of the National HPPA. And Eric, what's your take on at what point the horse should come under the jurisdiction of a racing?
Well, I think the challenge we all have, and we continue to have, and the reason we're in meetings like this is ensuring the integrity of horse racing. Everybody here wants to maintain that. Obviously, a big focus for us is that we need to make sure the priorities of the equine health and welfare are taken into play. As the layman that I've described myself, there was this churn several years ago with the use of biphosphonates, and this spurred on this particular topic as to when the regulators are going to be able to lay their hands on and be able to, as I describe it now, go through an out of competition testing scenario. I believe you have to associate it with an age or a point in time. As Matt alluded to in our discussions, I think one of the logical times is the first published work. Now, there are many that'll say some of the abuse of, in particular, biphosphonates were done in yearlings. I know when I first was informed about it, it was, the next cure for sesamoiditis. Everybody wants to find a cure to sales for sesamoiditis. Then it was closing knees on 2-year-olds. So at some point, there's a concern for the growth and the proper development of the horse. And unfortunately, when you look at defining when you can take a hold of them, you're going to have the challenges of funding. Obviously we can talk about and look at the BHA, but that's a much smaller group of horses. And when you have the magnitude that we do have, it really becomes difficult unless you are looking at a specific point in time, such as a first published work. And I believe that makes the most sense, and ultimately getting together, writing this, going through the survey in particular that Ed put out would be a great starting point. Look at what other jurisdictions are currently doing and see if we can come up with a model rule that makes sense for everyone.
That model rule in some states might require legislation.
Correct.
And I'm just a little in awe because I don't know how long it's been since I've heard the Jockey Club and the National HPPA actually agree on that major.
That's why I had to sit between them.
I think we should all. I think we should stop now. No, I think this just goes to what I said earlier today, is that everybody's trying to deal with the same thing. I mean, we struggled with this issue a few years ago when John Lord was our chairman, and we passed a couple of model rules, and we were trying to emulate the way states regulate motor vehicles, and we were looking to require a registration after the horse is registered with the breed registry, meets those requirements, to be registered as a racehorse. Now, obviously, what's been put on the table here today, it actually deals with the gap that Matt noticed, that Matt pointed out, is that when the horse actually participates in a published work, that there is an intent that that horse is going to be a racehorse. I think that might be an area of common agreement. What do you think of that, Tom?
Well, I was, say again what the question was.
That either by rule or law, the horse would come under the jurisdiction of the Minnesota Racing Commission once it has participated in a published workout, and I may throw a twist on that. It's a published workout, period. It makes him a potential racehorse in Minnesota.
Irrespective of where the workout takes place, or whether the
that would be
connections are licensed in Minnesota?
Well, let's just say that was dealt with legislatively, or would have to be dealt with legislatively.
I think the question would be is if the Racing Regulatory Authority recognized the workout
Correct.
and the public depended upon it, that facility or that horse would then come under the jurisdiction. I think that's the more narrow question.
Yeah, well, in that regard, I mean, if the workout takes place in Illinois, it's a published work, but the horse is not on the grounds, the owner or trainer may or may not be licensed. Let's assume the owner or trainer is not licensed in Minnesota. Then what we have is a horse in Illinois, presumably, by connections who aren't licensed in our state, and a horse that's not entered to race in our state, isn't part of our breeding program. I'm not sure what the nexus is to give Minnesota jurisdiction over that horse to do anything with it until it shows up in Minnesota.
Well, as a practical matter, I don't think Minnesota or anybody is going to send somebody to Illinois to draw an out-of-competition test or pull
Right.
records on a horse that there's no indication that they're going to come and race in your jurisdiction. Although there may be questions about a particular horse that maybe the Illinois Racing Board would have that authority.
Well, one of the things that concerns me is if we're given a charter that we don't have the resources or the wherewithal to do anything about. And that's part of what this scenario is. If there's gaps in our net, holes in our net, and this is part of the problem with 38 separate racing jurisdictions with varying priorities and resources, if there's holes in our net, you're going to be able to escape. A horse that's in Wisconsin or another non-racing state, we're not going to send our investigators or our vets or other people into that state to find out about that horse. I think there's better ways to build the fence, so to speak. And one of the things I was doing in preparation for this is going back and looking at the Ontario Working Group's year-long study of how to improve racing. And they do have some recommendations for pre-race careers. One is to expand the definition of a racehorse that reaches back to the pre-race career. Use of microchips or other technology to track veterinary or biological-based data and history. Enhancing education of industry members to support compliance. Tie licensing in a state to education so we increase awareness and understanding of some of these issues. And then one of the things that Eric and I were talking about earlier is greater use of certifications. You know, when people come to Minnesota now, they certify a trainer that they've got workers' comp insurance. They certify they're compliant with I-9 requirements for their workers. We could ask licensees to certify that they have not administered certain substances to a horse. If we use hair testing in such a way that we can look back, we could find out if that certification is correct or not, or we can do testing. So that's one way to at least hold people accountable for the period of time during which they actually had control of the horse.
Eric?
Well, just to expound a little bit on what Tom was saying, I believe that most of us in this room are experiencing this from the standpoint of it's prior to that trainer getting the horse. So the certification, as we discussed, how are you going to certify that 2-year-old pinhooking consignment or that yearling consignment? So at that point, are we still doing what's best for the horse? What I would like to see, and I think Dr. Havda said it in her presentation, there is a lack of facts and research being done. We don't want to go after writing rules just to write a rule. Finding out exactly if there is a concern and what that concern is, to me, is most important at this stage. And then finding out where are we going to attack and fix the problem.
Well, for instance, let's use bisphosphonates as an example. We know the difficulty in doing an out-of-competition test for bisphosphonates. It's time-based and so forth. And while we did set this up as jurisdiction for out-of-competition testing, if the horse is under the jurisdiction of the commission, you have other abilities to pull certain records associated with that horse. And you could do an audit of veterinary treatments, of veterinary records, and billing records, if you have reason to basically look at that. Thoughts? The resource issue that Tom indicated is real, but you know we deal with that resource issue every day in everything we do, and you know, we don't test every horse in every race because of the resource issue. I think most commissions would love to have the resources to deal with it. So we've got to develop strategies that frankly are deterrents. It's kind of like the cops with the radar guns. You know, they may not be on I-70 for 6 months, and then all of a sudden you turn a corner and there they are, and you're doing something you've been doing, and maybe you shouldn't have been doing it for the past 6 months. But you know, that's common in any type of enforcement. Is to keep people guessing, and you know, you want to keep honest people honest, and you know, there is an education gap that's been mentioned here today about what people know and what people don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people in this room learned a lot about bisphosphonates today, in details that may not be readily available to everybody in the industry. Any other comments? Any questions? Comments from the audience? Up to the microphone, Doc. We won't memorialize your golden tones unless you use the microphone.
Sorry about that. My question is, who pays for care, and what does it mean to take authority?
Well, the care is paid for by the connections to the horse. What do you mean? I'm trying to understand your question. Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, as a commission, if we take possession of the horse, then we're expected to be the caretaker of that horse for to provide for the care.
No, you would have regulatory authority over that horse as a racehorse at some point, which would give you the ability to ask certain questions or look at certain records or insulate yourself from a lawsuit if you should put that horse on a vet's list for a reason. and your jurisdiction didn't match, your action didn't match up with your jurisdictional authority. Now, I don't think anybody's envisioning that commissions would take care of the horses, and I think half the people in the industry would have a coronary if we were to suggest that.
Ed, I want to make sure that my comments are not taken to say that there are insurmountable burdens here, but I'm thinking back to the dialogue that we've had over out-of-competition testing for many years, and what are the substances that are going to be tested for, and some of which have therapeutic benefit and do not have performance-enhancing effects, or the horse is out of competition at that point. I think the same can be said about this discussion, is what is it that we're trying to accomplish, and what substances are we going to be concerned about?
Well, let's go back to bisphosphonates
Yeah,
for a minute.
that was my example.
The federal law allows veterinarians to use, in their medical judgment, and we heard about veterinary medical judgment, that's a little foggy. They have that authority, legal authority under federal law to use substances that aren't even approved for equines. They've been approved for other species, humans. Now, bisphosphonates have been approved for older horses to treat navicular disease, but a veterinarian under federal law would be legal to do what Carrie was talking about is happening in Kentucky. So, but if you created a special class of horse, a racehorse, that came under the jurisdiction of a state regulatory authority at a point, would you not then have some legal hook to insulate yourself to take a look-see here and there?
I think the answer to that question is if you have an objective criterion, like Eric or Matt have suggested, that defines a racehorse, because otherwise you're trying to discern somebody's intent to race the horse, and 25% or more are not going to race. But if you have an objective criterion, and that is fixed in statute, and there's a rational basis for relating that criterion to the health and safety of a horse over which you have jurisdiction, then I think you've got some argument that you can assert your authority over that.
Thank you, Counselor.
There's a lot of ifs.
You've just given us about $50,000 of legal advice for free. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Comments? Carrie.
Sorry for asking so many questions, but I'm actually fascinated by this. And also, when I get home, I think us breeders need to be way more involved, number one. I mean, I have a horse, I was telling Donnie, I had a horse at Tampa Bay last month. My vet bill was $1,800. I had a horse in Illinois, raced off the farm. My vet bill was $150. And the difference there was the trainer's choice, I assume, is a trainer's choice. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. I'm learning a lot right now. So here's my question. Without obviously a federal commissioner or anything like that coming into play, with what you were talking about, with you have 37 different jurisdictions, and for us in Kentucky, I feel like there's a huge disconnect between the breeders and the racing side of sharing information as to what is perceived as positive, negative, et cetera, with the veterinary. Is there some way is there some sort of way of facilitating that information being available more readily? Like, what communication channels are being produced from the problems of what you're talking about?
Go ahead.
Well,
Can we define that there's only 34 parimutuel? There's 34 parimutuel.
whether it's 34 or 54 or 104,
Okay.
everybody's trying to do the same thing.
Well, there are 38 with
38,
parimutuel
there's-
laws on the books, but 34 are active.
There's 34.
And then
Active.
we've got our members in Canada, we've got our friends from Jamaica. So I mean, these issues transcend that. How do we get the word out? Well, one of the things we're doing is we're actually videotaping this conference, and we're going to make it available to people who couldn't come. Now, whether people will take the time to watch any of these things is another story. But we do have a major education challenge. And I know this was discussed at the RMTC board meeting when the issue of bisphosphonates first came forward, is that we need to educate our veterinarians, we need to educate our breeders, we need to educate our sales companies. People are you know, we threw a bomb of a press release out, I think, just before Christmas. I hope we didn't ruin anybody's holiday, but our intent was to start a discussion on these issues, and that discussion is kind of what we're trying to work through here. Are there any clear answers other than increased education and getting word out? Well, the Jockey Club had, this issue was discussed at the Welfare of the Horse Summit. You know, the fact that we are all now discussing this again and looking at things where we might be able to agree as to how we can strengthen the regulatory network, at least in terms of making our horses. Now, possibly there's a self-policing aspect with regard to the sales companies. And that'll be discussed a little bit on one of the other panels. I think we're all, if we stay loose and we stay open-minded as to how to do this, we might actually get something done. Anybody else? Well, this is a very fast-talking panel on a very complicated issue, and I thank you all, and we're back on time, so.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, sir.
That's fine. Stand this whole time.